The screen was never supposed to be a door. Sergeant Mara Voss understood that, even as she stood in front of it. A shimmering rectangle of warped light, 3 meters tall and humming like a transformer about to blow, and felt the air against her face change temperature, not the air of the lab. Not the recycled, vaguely metallic bite of Outpost Kerrigan's lower levels. Something else, something dry and very old. "Castellan," she said, keeping her voice flat. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong." Behind her, Dr. Yusuf Castellan didn't answer right away. He was crouched over his terminal, his fingers moving fast, pulling telemetry off the sensor array. They'd spent 6 weeks reverse engineering from the wreckage of a Vorath scout ship. The array was the find of the century. A passive observation tool, the Xenotechs had called it, built to look forward and backward through local space-time. To scout trajectories before a Vorath vessel even committed to a jump. It didn't travel anywhere, it just watched. Except now it was doing something else. The resonance profile shifted when Reyna touched the calibration dial, Castellan said. The carrier wave went from passive observation to a hole in the universe, said Reyna herself from the far side of the room. She was 22, the youngest member of the team, and, as she just demonstrated, the most impulsive. She was also the reason the shimmer was now 3 meters tall, instead of 15 centimeters. She did not look sorry about this. Mara had learned, in 11 years of fighting the Vorath, to recognize the moment when a situation stopped being recoverable and started being something you had to run toward instead of away from. This was one of those moments. "We go through," she said. Castellan looked up. "We don't know where." "We go through," she said again. "Because if we don't, and that thing destabilizes on its own, we lose the only piece of intact Vorath technology we've ever recovered." And we explained to Admiral Hyung how Corporal Reyna accidentally folded space-time in Laboratory 7. She paused. "Or we go through, we learn something, and we come back." Corporal Reyna was already moving toward the shimmer. Mara didn't stop her. The 4 of them, Mara, Castellan, Reyna, and Sergeant Dek Okafor, who had been silent in the corner, and who now fell in behind them with the quiet competence of a man who had stopped questioning Mara's decision somewhere around the 3rd year. Stepped through. The shimmer collapsed behind them. They heard it go, a sound like a chord played on an instrument with no name, there, and then not. And then there was only the desert. It took 20 minutes for the implications to land fully. The sky was wrong, not in a poetic way, in a specific, technical, immediately alarming way. The particulate scatter in the upper atmosphere had changed the color of daylight to something faintly amber, like a photo taken through an aged filter. The air tasted of ash and iron. The ground beneath their boots was cracked in the hexagonal pattern of soil that had been baked and dried and baked again, over decades, without rain. Castellan ran atmosphere on his field kit. He read it twice before he said anything. "Oxygen is nominal," he said. "Carbon particulate is elevated. Radiation, background elevated but not acute. Temperature is 43 Celsius. He paused. "The positioning satellite is responding, but the orbital signature doesn't match. It's running old protocols." "Very old." "How old?" Mara asked. "At least 100 years." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Reyna said. "So we're yes," Mara said. The Vorath array hadn't been a viewer. Or rather, it was exactly what the Xenotechs had said. But it viewed time as a spatial dimension. And when Reyna had tweaked the calibration, she'd changed the focal length. The screen hadn't been showing them the future. It had been becoming it. They were standing on Earth. Just not the one they'd left. The mutants found them 11 minutes later. They came out of the ruins of what had once been, based on the street signs still visible beneath the rubble, a mid-sized coastal city. They moved in packs, 4 to 8 individuals, and they were not the shambling constructs of old entertainment. They were fast. They communicated in bursts of subsonic clicks that Mara's kit registered as pattern language, rudimentary but structured. They were hungry and they were angry, and they had learned, across however many generations, to be afraid of nothing that moved on 2 legs. Okafor opened fire. Mara pulled Reyna behind a collapsed wall. Castellan ran. In fairness, Castellan ran toward the cave entrance, that the ground-penetrating sonar ping on his kit had flagged 3 seconds before the mutants crested the rise, which was less like cowardice, and more like extremely rapid threat assessment. By the time the others caught up with him, he had already identified the tunnel beyond. And by the time the mutants reached the cave mouth, they had already descended far enough that the darkness gave them cover. Then the lights came on. Her name was Gadra, and she was the first android Mara had ever met that she couldn't identify as one until Gadra told her. She stood in the entrance to the lower level with the calm posture of someone who has spent considerable time around frightened armed humans and understood that stillness was the correct response. Her eyes were the giveaway, Mara decided, not the movement, but the processing. A slight, regular pause between input and response, like a comma inserted between hearing and understanding. "You're from before," Gadra said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Mara said. "How far?" "Over a century." Gadra processed that. "Then you missed it. The war, the end of it." She turned and walked into the light. "Come, Doctor. Var is expecting you, though he does not know it yet." The underground city was not what Mara had expected, and she had stopped having expectations around the second year of the Vorath War. It was vast, carved from bedrock over what Gadra explained had been 60 years of continuous excavation, and every surface was functional, no decoration. No art, except for the murals near what she would later learn was the children's sector, painted by hands that had needed to remember what green looked like. The people moved with the economy of those who have learned not to waste anything, including motion. Dr. Var was 70 and precise, in the way of people who have survived by being precise. He had white hair shaved close to his skull, and eyes that cataloged everything they touched. He shook Mara's hand and held it a moment too long, studying her face. "Military," he said. "Was," she said. "Still, the Vorath. Yes, they're gone, from our perspective. They came, they saw what we'd done to ourselves, and they decided there was nothing worth taking." He said it without bitterness. He'd had 60 years to metabolize it. We were already dying. They watched for a while, and then they left. That was the second cruelty. He walked her through the operations center. The star, maps, the hydroponics bays running under artificial light. The android construction bays where Gadra's kin were assembled in clean rooms by human hands that had learned to do the work without flinching. He showed her the ship. It was being built in a cavern that had been expanded over 20 years by controlled blasting. It was roughly the size of a pre-war cargo hauler, which meant it was not large, which meant the math was brutal. There were 1,100 people in the underground city. The ship could carry 200 maximum, plus the androids. There was a planet orbiting Alpha Centauri, probe data, decades old but consistent, that showed atmosphere, liquid water, reasonable radiation. Possible, not certain but possible. The council had voted 3 months ago on the passenger manifest. "It's not enough," Mara said. "No," Var agreed. "It isn't. But it's what there is." She could see in the way he said it that the sentence had been worn smooth by repetition. He'd said it so many times it had stopped hurting. She recognized that. She'd said similar things about casualty estimates. "What about the portal?" Castellan asked. He'd been quiet through the tour, running calculations. "The array, the technology we came through. Can you replicate it?" Var looked at him with interest. "Describe it." Castellan described it. Var listened without interrupting, and when Castellan finished, Var walked to the far wall and pulled up a schematic she recognized. "We recovered one of these 12 years ago," Var said. "We've been studying it as a potential power source. We didn't know it was." "A door," Reyna said. "A door," Var agreed. He turned to look at Mara, and she could see the calculation happening in real time, the reordering of a 60-year plan around a new variable. "Can you build it?" "If we had the components," Castellan said, "and enough power and enough time." "Time," Var said with a dry emphasis that was not quite a smile, "is apparently the one thing we might be able to arrange." They gave them 3 weeks. That was how long the launch window held. The orbital mechanics of Alpha Centauri's approach were unforgiving, and the ship had been calibrated for this window for years. 3 weeks. And then the trajectory recalculated, and the voyage extended from 4 years to 11, which the life support could not sustain. 3 weeks to build a time portal from salvaged Vorath components, surplus power couplings, and whatever Castellan could improvise from the city's fabrication bays. Mara did not sleep much. She ran the math obsessively, the way she'd run tactical projections before every engagement of the war. What did they have? What did they need? Where were the gaps? What happened if the gaps didn't close in time? She walked the construction bay and asked questions, and listened to the answers, and asked follow-up questions. She learned the names of the workers. She learned the names of the children. She learned the names of the dead. The list read in the common hall every morning, a ritual the Siddits had maintained since the first year, because Var had understood early that the living needed to know who they were preserving. Okafor found her on the third night sitting with a schematic she'd already memorized, staring at it without seeing it. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you plan for every possible failure mode except the one where everything goes fine." She didn't answer. He sat down next to her anyway, which was his way. "We've been in worse positions," he said. "Name one." He thought about it. "Kerrigan Station, Year 7. You had 4 personnel, no comms, a Vorath heavy cruiser sitting 20 kilometers off the port side, and a jury-rigged plasma relay held together with a coolant seal and optimism." "That's not. We're alive," he said. "That's what I remember about it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They're not going to all fit, Deck. Even if the portal works, even if we get home, the ship is going to take 200 people. There are 1,100 people in this city. I know. The ones who don't make it either ship, I know. And there's nothing. Mara." He put a hand on her forearm briefly the way he'd done after every engagement for 8 years. A specific pressure, a specific duration, a language with one word in it. "Build the portal. We handle what we can handle." She looked at the schematic. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. "Raina's calibration instinct," she said. "You realize that's the thing that saves us. A kid who can't stop touching dials." Okafor almost smiled. "Humanity's greatest tactical asset. Absolutely catastrophic decision-making in service of completely accidental genius. That's the H-Phi manifesto if I've ever heard one." She did laugh at that. A short, involuntary thing that surprised her and didn't embarrass her. He stood up. She kept working. The mutants breached on day 19. They didn't come from the surface entrance. The city had hardened that against exactly this kind of assault. 6 years of armored reinforcement. They came from the Eastern Tunnel Complex, through a passage that the city's surveyors had categorized as collapsed and impassable, because it had been, until it wasn't. Until however many months of sustained burrowing by several hundred mutants had removed the debris from the inside out, quietly, in the dark, the way a thing desperate and patient enough can unmake an obstacle one handful at a time. Mara heard the alarm and was moving before she understood what it was. The city had defenders, trained, organized, equipped with the best weapons the fabrication bays could produce, and they held the eastern corridor for 40 minutes, which was both impressive and not enough. The mutants kept coming. They weren't coordinated in the way of a military assault. They were coordinated in the way of a river finding low ground. And every time a section of the defense line redirected them, they found the next opening. The ship took a hit. Not a catastrophic one. The hull was still intact. The drive system still functional. But the boarding ramp was destroyed, and the secondary power coupling was sheared through, and the launch computer screamed errors in 4 systems simultaneously. Dr. Var stood in the operations center and looked at the damage report and said quietly, to no one in particular, "That's it then," Castellan said. "It's not." Var looked at him. "The portal," Castellan said. "We're at 83%. If we pull the power from the ship's secondary systems, the ones that are already gone, and reroute through the array, we can get to functional threshold. It won't be precise. We don't know what time period we're targeting. But it opens doors aren't destinations," Var said. "No," Mara said from the doorway. She had blood on her jacket that wasn't hers, and dust from the eastern corridor on her boots, and the focused stillness of someone who had moved through the calculation and come out the other side. "But they're a chance." She looked at the room. At Var, who was 70 and had spent 60 years keeping 1,100 people alive in the dark. At Gadra, standing at her usual station, processing without expression. At Raina, who had started all of this by touching a dial she wasn't supposed to touch, and who was now crouched over a power relay with a screwdriver and an expression of intense, narrow focus. At Okafor, who met her eyes and gave her the smallest possible nod. "Everyone who can move moves now," Mara said. "We're not picking 200 people. We're taking everyone." Var started to say something about the physics of the portal's stability under load. "I know," she said, "but the alternative is staying here, and I'm not doing that. I don't leave people. That's the rule." A long moment, the alarm was still sounding. Somewhere in the eastern tunnels, something heavy fell. "There's a rule I've had," Var said slowly, "for 60 years. Every morning, the names of the dead, so we remember. Every evening, a question. What do we preserve?" He looked at the room, and then at Mara. "I think, Sergeant, you are the answer to that question." They moved. The portal came alive in a way Castellan had not predicted and could not have engineered on purpose. He'd expected a stable opening, a controlled transit window, something they could walk through in an orderly manner. What he got was this: the array, overloaded with routed power, and the desperate calibration improvisation that Reyna performed by feel and instinct, and some inherited understanding of resonance that she couldn't articulate and didn't need to, produced a field that expanded to fill the cavern. Not a door, a flood. The shimmering light that had been a 3-meter rectangle opened outward, sideways, became a surface that moved like water, and Mara understood, in a single, clear instant, that it wasn't sending them back. It was sending them sideways, to somewhere adjacent to where they'd come from, to a time not precisely their own but close enough that the technology would be recognizable, the geography familiar, the people, the living people, unburned, unbombed, going about their ordinary lives, would be real. Not home, but a world, a living one. Go, she said, and they went, 1,100 people. They moved in the chaos of the mutants breaching the second corridor, moved through smoke and emergency lighting, and the sound of the android defense units holding the eastern approach, with a discipline that was, Mara thought, the purest form of loyalty she'd ever witnessed. Beings built to serve, choosing, in that choice's last expression, to stand between the living and the dark. Gadra was the last android through. She paused at the portal's edge and looked back at the cavern, at the city that had been the last country of humanity. And she said something in a language Mara didn't recognize. Then she stepped through. On the far side of the portal it was morning, temperate green. Mara stepped through last as she always did. She heard the array collapse behind her, the same chord it had made when they first arrived, the note of a door closing. And then there was grass under her boots, and a sky that was blue, genuinely, unambiguously blue, and 1,100 people standing in a field blinking in the light, like people who have been underground so long they'd forgotten what it felt like on the face. Reyna was sitting down in the grass, her knees pulled up, looking at her hands as if confirming they were still there. I need you to understand, Mara said to her, that your instinct just saved everyone in that cavern. I touched a dial I wasn't supposed to touch, Reyna said. Yes. That's the same thing, Reyna. Mara crouched down to her level. In 11 years of feeding the Vorath, I watched humanity win exactly 5 engagements through superior firepower. Every other victory came from someone doing something they weren't supposed to do, at the wrong time for the wrong reasons, and being exactly right about it. She looked at her. That is what we are. That is the whole thing, every time. Reyna looked out at the field, at the people, sitting and standing, and some of them crying. Not sadly, just in the way of pressure that has been held for too long and is now allowed to release. At the androids, standing small clusters, their processing eyes cataloging a world they'd been built for but had never inhabited. What do we do now? Reyna asked. Okafor answered from behind them, because he'd been there the whole time, which he always was. Now we figure out where we are. Then we figure out what resources we have. Then we figure out what needs doing, he paused. In that order. And the Vorath? Reyna said. Mara stood. She looked at the horizon, where the sky met the land cleanly without ash. She thought about 1,100 people, who had spent 60 years learning to survive on nothing, who could fabricate weapons and androids, and a starship in a cave with no outside supply chain, who could go 1,100 strong through a spatial anomaly caused by a miscalibrated dial, without any of them breaking and running. She thought about what the Vorath had seen when they came to the dead Earth of 2071 and looked at the rubble, and decided there was nothing worth taking. They hadn't been wrong, exactly. They'd just been in looking at the wrong thing. They'd seen the rubble. They hadn't seen what had survived the rubble. The Vorath, Mara said, have not yet met us. She let that sit for a moment in the morning air. But they will. She turned away from the horizon and walked toward the nearest group of survivors to find out who among them was a doctor, who was an engineer, who was a builder, and what needed doing first. She did not look at the sky again for a long time, because there was too much work in front of her to spend it looking up. That was, she thought, the other thing the Vorath had never understood, the thing that all of them, every species that had looked at humanity and done the math, and decided the math came out in their favor, had consistently, fatally missed. Humans didn't need to win the first fight. They didn't even need to win the second. They just needed to still be here at the end of the calculation. And they were remarkably, stubbornly, catastrophically good at that.